Hi, I'm Simon K. Jones, and you're listening to the audio version of my newsletter. Today, I'm talking about how to help new readers get on board a long-running serial. So today's post is for all you writers of serials, be it fiction or non-fiction. Helping readers navigate online serials is critically important. Back in May, I put together a sweeping overview of how to build your newsletter-based serial. I'll put a link down in the show notes. And today I'm going to drill into a very specific aspect of writing online serials, particularly if you're doing it via your own website or newsletter. This is the idea of the index post. You can see an example of the one I have if you visit the web version of my newsletter at simonkjones.substack.com and click the Start Reading Here post. Indexes do a lot of heavy lifting for new readers and really shouldn't be underestimated. But wait, I hear you cry. Why not publish on something like Wattpad, where it's already solved all of these UX issues? And it's a good question. My detailed response can be found in an old post, which again, I'll stick down in the show notes. But the short answer is that most of those platforms are closed and proprietary, meaning you don't own your audience, and you're therefore always going to be in thrall to their corporate whims. Whereas if you're using Substack or Ghost, Beehive, Buttondown, and so on, any of those newer kind of newsletter-based web platforms, it requires more work and you're doing it yourself a bit more, but you're building something that is more future-proofed. And if your chosen platform goes wrong or gets bought out by a crazy, rich, mad American, it's not as cataclysmic because you can just pick up your stuff and go somewhere else. Okay, moving on. So before I had an index. It's tricky to crunch the numbers specifically, but anecdotally, it's interesting to compare my newsletter and serial before and after having an index. I started publishing my online serial Tales from the Triverse in mid-2021, and for the first year and a bit I had no particular organisational structure beyond putting it in its own section. I sent out a new chapter each week, maybe shared it on social media, pinged it around the place, and that was about it. And that worked for maybe the first half a dozen chapters. Beyond that, though, I began to sense that I wasn't attracting many new readers, and that feeling got increasingly uncomfortable over time. As the serial grew, the idea of jumping on board became an increasingly intimidating experience. I wrote about this kind of in a slight fit of despair in September 2022 and was really unsure of what to do about it. Bear in mind, at that point I was 50 chapters into the damn thing. An entire year and I was still entirely clueless. There were many problems, some of them very small, several of which had easy fixes, and in retrospect they're all quite obvious, but at the time I was flailing about in the dark and trying to figure out how to go it alone without the infrastructure of a Wattpad or a Royal Road. I just need a sip of my coffee. That's better. Inexplicably, it wasn't until January 2023 that I created the index post, which is currently titled Start Reading Here. And like I say, it's anecdotal and based on general vibes rather than data, but after publishing that index and stapling it to the front of my Substack, new readers started to hop on board. The serial and my newsletter in general seemed to click in a way it hadn't before. Designing the index wasn't a simple matter of just listing all the chapters. I had to consider what to include and also, perhaps more importantly, what to not include. The index is linked to at the start of every single Triverse chapter. This means that if a new reader lands on a random chapter, for whatever reason, they can easily hop to the start and figure out what the hell is going on. One click and they're good to go, regardless of their actual entry point. I used the copy choose another story instead of read from the start or get started here. I don't know if this is a good call or not, but it seems appropriate for this particular serial and emphasises that a new reader could hop on wherever they want. I benefit here from Triverse being a bit of an anthology series. The way I've structured Triverse is as a collected series of short stories, interconnected but also semi-standalone. Most of those stories are multi-part, so each story has a defined name, but not each part, hence a storyline called An Unintended Life, will go out as newsletters with titles An Unintended Life Part 1, An Unintended Life Part 2, and so on. The reason I mention this is that listing all of those individual parts in the index would be visually absurd and require a daft amount of scrolling. Being able to navigate to an individual part in the context of the index didn't have a strong use case. New readers wouldn't be doing that at all, and regular readers probably wouldn't be able to remember the precise part within the story if they were looking for something in particular. I settled instead on breaking the overall series into seasons and episodes. The seasonal structure is largely imposed after the fact and has little actual bearing on the story itself, but it makes the whole thing more approachable. It's immediately easy to understand, borrowing terminology from television. It made navigation more obvious, subtly made the point that you could hop on whenever you wanted, and explained the notion of an online serial without having to actually explain it. By collapsing those multi-part storylines into single episodes in the index, it makes Tales from the Triverse far less intimidating to a newcomer. A 5-part story becomes a single link. Alongside the episode titles, each of which links through, I also added one-line summaries. Again, borrowing from TV, these are a bit like the summary you might see on a Netflix episode listing. With all of these things, the reference is not to the novel. I think comparisons to novels are actually quite unhelpful, because an ongoing serial bears very little resemblance to the experience of reading a novel. Sure, they both tell their stories using words, but structurally and practically, they function entirely differently. A critical aspect was dropping the chapter numbers. I removed these not only from the index, but also from each individual post that had already been published. The numbering didn't help with navigation, and only served to emphasise the sheer, ever-increasing length of the serial. It made the reading commitment feel unwieldy, like a mountain to climb. So here's the bad version of the user journey. 1. Someone recommends Tales from the Triverse. 2. The potential new reader ends up on the web version of the latest chapter, called something like Chapter 245, exciting story name, Part 6. They think, WTF, I'm not catching up on 245 chapters. 4. They leave. They possibly block me. And here's the good user journey of the same thing. 1. Someone recommends Tales from the Triverse. 2. The potential new reader ends up on the web version of the latest chapter, called exciting story name, Part 6. They think, what is this? Part 6, eh? They click the Choose a Different Story link at the top of the chapter. They land on the index, explore a bit, dive in. Turns out that person is an influential publisher who buys the rights to the print version. Step 7. Denis Villeneuve develops the TV show adaptation. Step 8. People go to Comic-Cons dressed as characters from Triverse. Step 9. I think, phew, good job I made that index. Most people will fall somewhere in between those two extremes. Thanks for listening. I hope that was useful, and I should tip my hat towards Clifford Stoom for sending my brain off in this general direction with a note a couple of weeks back, and I hope I didn't completely mangle your surname just then. Okay, do check the show notes for more links off to different bits and pieces, and you can find more at simonkjones.substack.com.